So I've come up to the pluck. It's covered in snow. Take some of the snow off. There's a portrait of a young man. It's a very Soviet-looking design, the young man in profile. He's looking forward into a bright future. Underneath it says, Ich было девять. There were 9 of them. And then higher up it says, in this mountain pass, on a freezing night on the 2nd of February, 1959, some tourists from the Ural Polytechnic Institute died. And then it lists their names. Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the group, Zina Kolmogorova, Yuri Doroshenko, Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Ludmila Dubinina, Nikolai Bobrignol, Semyon Zolotaryov. He was the oldest one in the group. He was 38 years old when he died. Then it says, in the memory of those who have gone and will never return, we have named this mountain pass in their honor the Dyatlov Pass. It's quite sobering looking at this and realizing just how young these people were, how much of life they had ahead of them, and how little they expected when they pitched their tent on the slope of this mountain that would be the last night of their lives.
Welcome to the BBC World Service. I'm Lucy Ash, and in this programme, I'm exploring one of the most baffling cold cases in Russian history, a case which has inspired countless theories over the decades. But this year, the authorities opened a new investigation and now promise to get to the bottom of it once and for all. I'm starting at the train station in Yekaterinburg, Russia's 4th biggest city, just east of the Urals, the mountains which divide Europe from Asia.
And I'd better get on the train quite quickly because it's about to leave. I think we're in the second coupe along. Let's get through here. It's very narrow in the corridor here in the train, and people are busy making up their bunk beds for the night because we're going to be on this train for 11 hours. I'm following the journey that was taken by students who went on a cross-country skiing trip. Their story aroused curiosity of people all around the world. Now I want to find out for myself more about the mysterious circumstances in which they died 60 years ago. The expedition into the mountains was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. He was a 5th-year student and member of the sports club at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Yekaterinburg, or Sverdlovsk, as the city was called in Soviet times.
He always brought something back from his trips for our mum. Some gemstones or fir cones or unusual plants. She always looked forward to his gifts from the mountains.
Tatyana Perminova was in awe of her brilliant older brother. She tells me about his interview to get into university, where competition for a place was fierce.
Было очень жарко, и у них вентилятор стоял, у комиссии стоял вентилятор на столе. That day, it was very hot and there was a fan on the table, but it didn't work. So the head of the selection panel asked Igor to fix it. Igor said, "OK, I will try, give me a screwdriver." He took it apart and said, "There's nothing wrong with it, you just have to oil it from time to time." And he made it work. And he got his place, of course.
Igor was a skilled mechanic, but he set his sights much higher. It was an exciting time to be a young Soviet scientist. It felt as if anything was possible after the USSR launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth.
Космонавтика началась в 1957 году, когда запустили спутник. In 1957, astronautics began. Igor decided to make a telescope to observe the stars.
He decided to make his own telescope?
Да.
To try and look at the Sputnik?
Да. Yes. The radio always transmitted the time when the satellite would fly over us. And me, my sister, Igor, and my best friend climbed onto the roof and looked at the satellite. It was so fantastic. He was very talented. Imagine, the war had just ended and the country was utterly devastated. Everything had to be restored. Specialists were needed. They wanted to learn new things, study well at school, serious topics, engineering, physics, complex technical topics. Everybody wanted to work hard for their homeland. They were real Soviet people, in the best sense of the word.
The taunting beeps from that tiny aluminium sphere sent a clear political signal. The Soviet Union was hurtling ahead in the space race. Although President Eisenhower tried to dismiss Sputnik as just a ball in the air, the Americans were very much on the back foot. We can trace the students' trip up to a certain point through their diaries, photographs and letters. 20-year-old Ludmila Dubinina had a reputation as a serious young communist. But in this diary entry, it sounds like she was beginning to loosen her neat blonde plaits. She writes, "В поезде во все горла орали песни под мандолину, да и просто так. Затем вдруг..."
In the train, we all sang songs, accompanied by a mandolin. Then, out of the blue, this drunk guy came up to our boys and accused them of stealing a bottle of vodka. He demanded it back and threatened to punch them in the teeth. But he couldn't prove anything, and eventually got lost. We sang and sang, and no one even noticed how we slipped into a discussion about love, and kisses in particular. We talked all kinds of nonsense. Everyone was shouting out their opinions. Everyone wanted to join in.
So ever since I got up this morning, all I could see out the window were birch trees and snow. But the sun's out, which is nice. Looks like we're coming into the station. We finally stopped. The conductor is letting some steps down so we can come down. She says, be careful coming out. До свидания, спасибо. Right, so we're now in Ivdel, but we're not at the end of our journey by any chalk.
Alexander.
Очень приятно. So we've just been met by Alexander, our guide. He's wearing a lime-coloured hat. And the next stage of the journey is by bus on the road for 3 hours.
Zinaida Kolmogorova, another member of the group, who studied radio engineering with the team leader Igor, wrote to her family once she got off the train.
Dear Mum, Dad, Tom, Galia and Lucia. Well, I'm away from you again. We are going camping, 10 of us, and it's a great bunch of people. I have all the clothes I need, so do not worry about me. How are you? Has the cow calved yet? I love her milk. How's your work going, Mum? And Dad, I hope you're feeling okay. How are Galia and Lucia doing at school? Lucia, try not to have C's again this term. And Galia, turn your D's in sports to C's. Spend more time on your skis and you need to run more. Big kisses to you all. Your Zina. P.S. Write to me in Vijay. I'm looking forward to your letters.
Zinaida and Igor sent their last letters home from the post office in Vijay. They spent the night here on January the 25th, 1959.
So we just got out the bus and we're in the settlement of Vijay. There's a red flag fluttering over some of the houses here. It's a Soviet flag, actually, and one of the guides was joking, maybe people here don't know that the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. But we are actually in a really remote place. We've been driving for hours along roads that were built by prisoners from the Gulag. There were lots of prison camps in this region, and it's a seriously cut-off place.
Now that we've run out of roads, we get on snowmobiles for the last leg of the journey. Since I'm following in the footsteps of the students, I should be on cross-country skis, but I'm taking the easy way out, says our guide Alexander, or Sasha for short.
Мы поднимаемся, средняя скорость километров 7-8.
Our average speed is 7 to 8 kilometres an hour along this track, and it's not too bad. But the students would have followed the river valley and the hunting tracks of the Mansi, the indigenous people who live in this area. Physically, it was very hard work, because they had to carry all their supplies and their tent.
Their rucksacks got even heavier the next day after one member of the group, a 22-year-old economics student, had to turn back, as Zinaida writes in her diary.
Yura Yudin is leaving us today. His sciatic nerves flared up again and he has decided to go home. Such a pity. We distributed his load in our backpacks.
The students had spent the night at a logging base called the 41st Settlement, where they enjoyed chatting to the lumberjacks around a warm stove.
It turns out this is our last day of civilization and the last chance we had to sleep in beds. Tonight we are going to be in a tent. We've been skiing through a pine forest. There was sun in the morning. Now it's very cold. All day long we followed the river. At night we'll camp on a Mansi trail. I burned my mittens and Yura's quilted jacket at the campfire. He cursed me a lot.
We're now on the final leg of our journey, going on a steep track uphill to the Dyatlov Pass. And it's a lot narrower, and I'm glad I got my helmet on because I keep getting whacked by twigs and branches on the way. But it's a really stunning scene, like something off a Christmas card. Pine trees and birch trees laden down with snow. There are animal footprints, reindeers, there are wolverine and lynx in these woods as well. At the moment, the sky looks quite blue. The weather's nice, but I'm told up on the mountain it can change at any minute. It's really unpredictable.
The students were heading to Mount Atorten. Apparently that means don't go there in the language of the Mansi, the indigenous reindeer herders. As I follow Sasha uphill, a biting wind picks up.
I can't feel the side of my face. So cold. There's a very deep bit here. Gotta watch your step. In some places, the wind's driven the snow in very delicate layers. It looks like frosting on a cake. In other places, you just sink in. Oh, that's it. I've gone over now. I totally missed that one. I didn't see it coming.
We're above the forest and there are just a few dwarf pines and flinty rocks poking through the snow. On the night of February the 1st, the students pitched their tent here on the slope of Cholachakl, which means Mountain of Death.
I've just been climbing up the eastern flank of Mount Cholachakl. I'm completely knackered, and we've only done like about a kilometre.
Когда шла группа туристов Дятлова, им было гораздо тяжелее, потому что...
Well, it would have been harder for the young tourists because when they came here, it was February and much colder, about 30 degrees below freezing, and there were strong winds. But they were very fit young people, and they still managed.
But you know, Sasha, this seems like an odd place to pitch your tent on the eastern flank of Cholachakl. You know, why didn't they look for a more sheltered spot?
Ну, вы не первый, кто задается этим вопросом.
You're not the first person to ask that. It doesn't seem like a sensible place for a tent when they could have gone down into the valley by the river where they could find water and wood for their fire. Maybe they had climbed up this far and didn't want to lose any height, but it does seem like a strange place for an experienced group to camp.
Igor Dyatlov, the group leader, had promised to telegraph the sports club at the university as soon as the group returned safely to their base at Vizhai on February the 12th. At first, nobody was surprised they didn't return on time. Bad weather often caused delays. But by February the 20th, nobody had heard from the group for 3 weeks. Increasingly worried, the students' families raised the alarm, and the institute sent out a search party made up of student volunteers. Mikhail Sharavin, now in his 80s, was one of them.
И вот мы прошли порядка 500 метров, И тогда слева я заметил палатку. Так.
We climbed up to the pass and we'd gone on about 500 metres when on the left I saw the tent. Part of the canvas was poking up from under the snow. One of the tent poles was sticking up and you could see the triangle shape of the tent at one end, but the rest was covered in snow. Nearby we saw an ice pick and some skis. I used the ice pick to uncover the entrance.
You looked inside the tent. What did it look like inside?
Сверху лежат одеяла, потом рюкзаки посланные.
There was a blanket, some rucksacks, and all the boots were in a pile in one corner. There was a route map, official papers, money, and a flask of vodka. There was also some pork fat cut into slices. It's a high-calorie food that hikers take with them into the mountains. It was sliced up on a plastic plate as if they were getting ready to have supper or something and didn't have time.
And there was something else. Mikhail noticed that the tent had been slashed open from the inside. Maybe they were in a desperate hurry to get out, but why? Then he spotted something even stranger.
А рядом с палаткой обнаружили следы.
Near the tent we saw frozen footprints. It looked as if they were made by people wearing socks or barefoot. There was only one boot print. So they must have left the tent half-dressed and the tracks continued for 5 to 10 metres from the tent and then they disappeared and sometimes we saw a few footprints further down the slope.
То появятся, то пропадают.
Were you surprised? You must have been very surprised.
Было сомнение.
Well, our first thought when we saw the tent was to find out whether there might be any people in there, but there was no one. How could they still be alive somewhere when they left like that? Barefoot in socks, we were shocked.
Mikhail and another man in the search party immediately skied downhill to tell the others what they'd found.
И когда мы сели ужинать,
when we sat down at the camp for our evening meal, I suggested that we open a flask of spirit we found in the tent and proposed a toast for the Dyatlov group. We drank it and a guy named Passion said that we better not drink to their health, but to their eternal peace.
Считает, что люди мертвые.
The following day, 6 days after the search began, their worst fears were confirmed, says Mikhail.
Но когда мы к кедру подошли, 20 метров до кедра осталось.
We approached the cedar tree, and when we were 20 metres away, we saw a brown spot. It was towards the right of the tree. And when we got closer, we saw 2 corpses lying there. The hands and feet were brown. It was very striking, and closest to the tree, we saw the remains of a campfire.
One of the 2 bodies was Yuri Doroshenko. Zinaida fell in love with him during a previous camping trip when he chased off a brown bear with a geologist's hammer. Next to him was Yuri Krivonishenko, who played the mandolin and loved telling jokes. Both men were stripped to their underwear. Igor's body was found next. He was dressed but shoeless and lying face down in the snow, hugging a birch branch. It took several days for news of his death to reach home, says his youngest sister, Tatiana.
Да, конечно, это я помню. Я помню, что это был вечер.
Of course I remember, because it was just before the holiday on March the 8th. It was the evening and I was making my mother a gift. She was raising dough to make pies. The phone rang. I picked up the phone and a male voice asked me if there were any adults home. I handed the phone to my elder brother and he was informed that Igor was dead. And the next day my parents were summoned to the institute and the nightmare began.
И после этого начался, конечно, кошмар.
Tatiana says her mother had tried to stop Igor from going on the camping trip.
Сначала не хотела, потому что она говорила, что тебе же нужно уже ехать на преддипломную.
She said he was about to graduate and should get on with his thesis. And he pleaded with her, "Just one last time, Mum, just one last time." And indeed it was his last time. And until the end of her life, our mum could not forgive herself for letting him go on this trip. She never came to terms with his loss, especially since it was such a terrible and incomprehensible death.
Они здоровые, опытные, крепкие ребята, умные, да? Это так.
Healthy, experienced, strong and very smart young people could not so easily freeze to death, especially since they had warm clothes and everything they needed. The idea is completely out of the question.
По официальным данным, они погибли от мороза, то есть запечатлено то, что сделан анализ, как бы.
Officially, it was stated that they died of hypothermia and frostbite. But some of the other bodies had serious injuries that had nothing to do with the cold.
My guide Sasha explains that the following day the search party found another student with a fractured skull. A bit lower down lay Zinaida Kolmogorova. From the position of her body, it seemed as if she'd been desperately trying to scramble back towards the tent. There was a long, bright red bruise on the right side of her torso, which looked as if it was made by a baton. The mystery deepened when the remaining 4 bodies were found in a ravine nearly 3 months later, once the snow had melted. 3 of the group had fatal injuries, including one whose skull had been smashed moments before his death. Lyudmila Dubinina, the ardent young communist, and Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group, suffered chest fractures that could have only been caused by an immense force comparable to that of a car crash. And one gruesome detail: these last 2's eyeballs were missing, and Lyudmila had no tongue. Tatiana didn't go to Igor's funeral. Her parents thought it would be too traumatic for her.
Вот, но я видела фотографию его в гробу, да, это ужасно.
I saw a photo of him in the coffin afterwards. It was just terrible. He looked completely different to what he looked like before. My mum said that she only recognised him from the gap between his teeth. His hair was grey.
His hair was grey?
Да. Ужас.
Yes, awful.
Родители, они всегда считали,
all the parents believed these deaths were somehow related to the military. At least my parents thought that immediately. What went on up there is hard to say. The families were told, you will never know the truth, so stop asking questions. So what could we do? Don't forget, if they told you to shut up in those days, you would be silent. You would not ask any more questions.
Замолчать. И ты замолчишь, и все. И не задаешь вопросов больше.
Who or what was to blame for their deaths? That's coming up in part 2 of the Dyatlov Pass Mystery with me, Lucy Ash, after the news. I'm Lucy Ash, and you're listening to the Dyatlov Pass Mystery on the BBC World Service. 60 years ago, 9 Russian students were found dead in bizarre circumstances, killed on a cross-country skiing trip. Their bodies were found with strange injuries, and people immediately questioned what or who was responsible. The North Ural Mountains are remote and devoid of people. Even the prison camps once scattered across the region are now decaying and deserted. But there are some small communities who've lived here for thousands of years.
Hello? Valera? Здравствуйте. Можно снимать здесь, да? Хорошо.
The Mansi are one of 45 indigenous peoples living in Russia. In their language, the name Mansi means forest dweller. They've survived over the centuries by hunting, fishing, and reindeer herding. I went to meet one of the local tribe leaders.
It's lovely and warm in here.
Valery Anyamov, a rugged man in his 40s, works as a forest warden and lives in the settlement of Ushma. He welcomes us into his log cabin for some much-needed hot tea. Valery's father, Nikolai, helped to look for the missing students, and yet an accusing finger was initially pointed at his community.
Когда пропала группа Дятлова, обвинили наших Манси в том, что...
When they first went missing, they blamed us Mansi. They said we must have killed them.
Because no one else lives around here.
Мы здесь живем недалеко.
Yes, even though the closest Mansi village is 100 kilometres from the Dyatlov Pass. But that's what they decided at the time. And so the Mansi were arrested and interrogated.
How many people?
Я точно не знаю.
I don't know. Quite a few. One woman from another village who's not with us anymore, she used to say that the secret police tortured them.
They were tortured?
Ну, не пытали, ну, расспрашивали, скажем.
Well, I don't know. Interrogated them at any rate. The Soviet authorities tried to prove some link for around a month and finally gave up. They then flew their helicopters to our villages and asked us for help. Thanks to our guys, the skiers were found. They'd found some bodies, but it was only with our help that they found the rest.
Suspicions still linger about the Mansi's possible involvement. One book published in 2015 suggests that some Mansi hunters were high on the magic mushrooms used in shamanic rituals, and they went berserk when they found that the students had veered onto sacred Mansi land.
Журналисты раздули эту историю.
A lot of journalists have been trying to blow this story up to boost their ratings, and many of them brazenly lie. They take advantage of the fact that we Mansi are few in number, and there aren't enough of us to denounce these rumours. All that stuff about bad places and areas of negative energy was invented by the mass media.
Tell me about the mountains of Otorten, because I understand that Otorten means don't go there.
Атартен по-нашему.
Atarten means mountain with swirling winds. That don't go there thing was made up by journalists, or it was a mistranslation.
Some people have written books accusing the Mansi people of being involved in the killing of the young students 60 years ago. What do you think about that?
Мы этому не придаем значения.
We don't pay much attention because these are fantasies. If any of our people had been involved, they would have thrown us all into prison because it was a cruel time, a strict time. People were executed by a firing squad without investigation or trial.
Do you have any theory about why they died, who killed them, or are you just not interested?
Я интересуюсь.
I am interested, but I'm not sure. I lean towards more of a technological explanation, that it was part of a rocket which fell off somewhere and poisoned the Dyatlov group. Actually, there's a story my mother told me which could be relevant.
Valeri's mother Sanka sits by the stove wearing boots made of reindeer fur decorated with embroidery. She's now in her 80s and one of a shrinking number of people alive at the time of the incident. One evening she was out collecting firewood when she noticed something strange in the sky.
We
were coming back from the forest and we could see the village when this bright burning object appeared. It was wider at the front and narrower at the back, with a tail, and there were sparks flying off it. And it passed over the village, and people from the neighbouring village saw it as well.
Was this in February 1959? So she says I was 20 then, and it happened 60 years ago, and now she's 80. So it sounds like it was about the right kind of time. What did people in the village say about it?
The old people said it was something that caused illnesses, something that was harmful to people.
While officials said that the students had died of hypothermia, some of their injuries suggested otherwise. Might their deaths be more than just an accident? And if the mysterious lights in the night sky are to blame, were they celestial or man-made? Are we talking about a comet or a rocket? After meeting the Mansi, I make the long journey back to the city of Yekaterinburg, where the students had attended university. I'm going to visit a man who's made it his life's mission to keep the memory of the students alive.
Алло?
Какая встреча.
Юрий Константинович.
Да,
Очень приятно.
И мне-то, а мне-то каково?
Я Lucy из BBC.
Да, похоже, я помню вас по интернету.
Yuri Kuntsevich opens the door with a big grin. He's dressed smartly with a blue tie and wearing trousers held up by suspenders. He was just a young boy when the tragedy happened.
В 12 лет я был на похоронах группы. Я там жил на этой улице. Вот, я туда пришел.
When I was 12 years old, I went to the funerals of this group. I lived on the same street as the cemetery. There were rumours flying all over the city that these students had wandered into some kind of tests or experiments. The coffins were open, and I could see that the skin on their faces was a weird colour, the colour of bricks. But this was only something people talked about in their kitchens. There was nothing about it in the newspapers, so people saw this as some kind of state secret.
Growing up, Yuri gradually became more and more fascinated with the case.
My brother took me to the Ural Polytechnic Institute and registered me in the hiking club. We went on lots of walks and trips, and every year we used to go and put flowers on the memorial up on the pass in their memory. I talked to the students who knew Igor Dyatlov, and they believed there'd been an explosion of some kind.
Why was it so important for you to find out what had happened to this group of tourists, of hikers? Вы все время думали о том, что случилось с этой группой, да?
Мы их все время помнили.
Вы все время
И те, кто их знал лично, постоянно
We always remembered them, and I started this foundation in their memory, an official organisation which can legally seek information from the authorities. And the people in the prosecutor's office are not especially happy with what we're doing.
For you, it's become almost like a sacred duty. It's almost an obsession.
Да, очень.
Completely.
So you're keeping this in this safe, locked up. So these are original copies of personal documents of the group. It's going to get them out for us.
Today, Yuri's apartment is a mini museum. On the walls are oil portraits of each of the dead students. Shelves and drawers are crammed with books, papers, photographs, and personal possessions they once owned, from compasses to this Red Army gramophone, which Yuri cranks up for me.
С солдатами вернулся после победы, и их уже использовали здесь где-то.
Well, the soldiers brought these players back with them from the front after the victory, and they were used here. But you know, they are quite small and couldn't make that much noise if there was a dance in a hut or a village hall, so Igor Dyatlov took an amplifier with him on expeditions.
After all these years of investigating, what's Yuri's own theory about the students' untimely end?
Да никто не может сказать 100%.
Nobody can be 100% sure. Maybe they died on the spot because they were the victims of some kind of experiment, and then it was staged to make it look as if they had frozen to death.
Staged? Yuri sees the confusion on my face and tries to explain.
Вот смотри, они погибли. Их доставили
Look,
в морг.
they died and were kept in a morgue, but then military command showed up and said this is an emergency and we need to get rid of the bodies. So they loaded them all up and took them back to the mountain and told a search party to go looking for them and make it seem like they froze to death.
The Soviet military were capable of inhuman acts, but would they really take the trouble to dump corpses onto a mountainside? Surely there were simpler ways to make dead bodies disappear.
You've got so much material, Yuri. Does it help you to find out the truth about this case?
Да, конечно, мы чувствуем себя, понимаешь, вот прикасаясь к документам, мы чувствуем.
Yes, of course. Look, here is the passport of Yuri Yudin. He was an economist. And here is Zina's school report, academic record book, and everywhere it says Otlitschnitsa, which means excellent, top of the class. Her family gave this to me.
Do you think that the documents help you to find out what actually happened?
Время понимать, что это были за люди.
It is important for us that people understand who the Dyatlov group were as individuals. Some people go through life and don't leave much of a trace, but these were people who worked for the good of society, who did leave something good behind them.
Общественно полезные, общественно активные.
I couldn't get a straight answer out of Yuri or any real evidence to back up his theories. But he's not alone in believing there's been a state-sponsored cover-up. Even Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, who studied at the Ural Polytechnic Institute just a few years before Igor Dyatlov, felt there was something odd about the case. So we tracked down another sleuth, Oleg Arkhipov, who lives in the nearby city of Tyumen. He's a devotee of Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. Oleg turns up to our hotel wearing a deerstalker hat, just like the famous literary detective. He has written 3 books on the Dyatlov Pass incident and is about to publish his 4th. Oleg has unearthed some interesting documents, and he made friends with the former prosecutor, Lev Ivanov, who first investigated the deaths and led the official inquest in 1959.
Лев Иванов очень взялся активно за это дело.
At first, Ivanov began to work on this case very enthusiastically. His daughter told me he was very experienced and worked hard trying to understand everything. During the investigation, he asked the forensic expert about the causes of the severe physical traumas. He was told that it was something like an explosion wave. After this, Ivanov shouldn't have closed the case, but he was under pressure to do so, and the authorities tried to prevent information from spreading.
What if he'd said, no, I want to carry on?
Then he would have been sent to Evdel, not as an investigator, but as a prisoner. In those days, opposing the party meant not only the end of your career. That was, unfortunately, the reality of our country.
And yet, elements in this case are so puzzling and contradictory that even the Soviet authorities weren't sure how to describe what happened.
They thought about the best official explanation for these deaths and came up with an insurmountable force of nature. Of course, everyone understands this phrase differently. It could describe a hurricane or a tornado, but not necessarily.
Ivanov was transferred to an obscure town in the Republic of Kazakhstan, and the affair was buried for 3 decades. He only found the courage to speak out when the Soviet Union began falling apart. In 1990, he gave an interview to a newspaper in which he admitted that he'd been amazed by the results of the autopsy on the students and that he'd received several reports about balls of fire in the sky. But he'd been ordered to classify his findings and forget about them. In the newspaper article, Ivanov apologised to the relatives of the victims for hiding the truth from them and said he'd tried his best, but at the time there was an overwhelming force in the country and that only now it's possible to defeat it. After his death, Oleg Arkhipov got access to the investigator's personal archive and discovered some curious details about the post-mortems, including the fact that some of the students' clothing had traces of radiation.
The first autopsies took place in a little morgue, and representatives of the KGB, not the local police, surrounded it. They didn't let anyone in. The atmosphere was very serious, and a big barrel of alcohol was delivered.
Just explain, why is this spirit, this pure alcohol, so important? What does it signify?
That suggests that before the autopsy, some people knew the bodies were contaminated. It's a primitive form of protection from radiation.
But there are other uses for alcohol, for pure spirit in a morgue, apart from protection from radiation, surely.
It's one thing just bringing small containers of alcohol to store fragments of organs, but they were given clear instructions to wipe themselves all over with alcohol, to rub it all over their naked bodies. After the autopsy. That was the whole point. Such measures never normally took place in those days. It was without precedent.
Let's imagine that it was some sort of testing of weapons. Why did it only affect those 9 people? Why wasn't the whole area contaminated with radiation?
Geographically, this area is huge. Secondly, at the time of the deaths, many animals and birds were found dead, and local people were banned from using water from wells. They had to bring in water from elsewhere. These are known facts.
It's true the Mansi did tell me their reindeer herds were banned from the area and hunting wasn't allowed for 4 years after the incident. But Arkhipov has more.
Вот в этих актах вскрытия отмечено.
In the autopsy reports, it mentions that fragments of the internal organs for the first 5 bodies were sent for chemical analysis. There's a signed paper saying the organs were successfully delivered and were stored in a fridge. What happened after that, I had to investigate myself. And I learned that 2 chemists conducted the analysis, and as soon as the results were known, some people came and took the organs away, along with the paperwork.
Даже фрагменты внутренних органов и сами акты были изъяты.
But what do you think happened the night of the 1st of February?
На сегодняшний момент совершенно не исключаю, это большая...
Today, I don't exclude the possibility that the problem fell from the sky, meaning there was an explosion. It's impossible to say whether it was a military rocket, but why did the young people leave their tent in such a hurry? Because they couldn't breathe, perhaps? Maybe they were affected by poisonous rocket fuel.
There's also been talk of shockwaves from a low-flying jet, which maybe terrified the students and forced them to run semi-clad into the snow. Some theories seem credible, others less so.
The Yeti is just one of many names for the large, hairy creatures said to live in remote wildernesses around the world.
In this documentary, Russian Yeti, The Killer Lives, the evidence is based on the violent injuries suffered by the students and one blurry photograph taken by a member of the group of a tall figure behind a tree.
The northern Urals, where the students were found, is one of the most remote locations in the world, a perfect spot for a Yeti to survive.
I'm confident that there is some form of creature existing today in Russia.
In all, around 75 theories have been put forward, including an alien abduction. Perhaps in response to so much speculation, in February this year, the Russian authorities announced they were reopening the case.
Намерены проверить с привлечением экспертов как наиболее вероятные 3.
Alexander Kurenoy, spokesman for the Prosecutor General, said only 3 possible causes would be investigated, all of them connected with extreme weather.
Криминал исключается полностью, подчеркиваю. Нет ни одного доказательства и хотя бы...
Crime is out of the question, he told a packed press conference. There is not a single proof. It was either an avalanche, a falling slab of hard-packed snow, or a hurricane. Igor Dyatlov's sister Tatiana isn't convinced.
You've
seen for yourself. What kind of avalanche could there have been when their tent poles were still standing up? A hurricane? Well, maybe, but it's possible to survive a hurricane. As for a snow slab which crushed their tent, that doesn't explain the injuries they had. And if it was just an ordinary hike which went wrong because of extreme weather conditions, well, those happen all the time. So why did it worry the highest authorities in the country? I think it means something extraordinary happened.
But does it? Perhaps the most obvious explanations are overlooked. Could Luda's missing tongue and eyes, for example, be the work of wild animals? Her body lay undiscovered for nearly 4 months. Anyway, if the authorities had something to hide, why would they reopen the case now? In Moscow, I met Natalia Varsegova of Russia's biggest-selling newspaper, Komsomolskaya Pravda. Together with her journalist husband, Nikolai, she's been covering the Dyatlov case for the past 7 years, and she doesn't accept the weapons testing theory.
Допустим, их убили случайно, они случайно попали туда, куда не должны.
Let's suppose they were killed by accident. They went somewhere they shouldn't have been. Then soldiers would have come and quickly cleaned everything up, transferred the corpses to families and forced them to sign non-disclosure agreements. And there is no way the military would have allowed ordinary civilians, friends of the students, to join the search party on that mountain.
Мне очень странно представить себе, что...
It's very strange for me to imagine that someone killed them and then scattered their bodies along the slope, because one of the soldiers would let it slip before he died to some of his relatives. Someone would have said something in drunk company. We have a country where nobody can keep any secrets.
This happened 60 years ago. Like, why does it matter so much obviously it matters to the friends, to the relatives, to the families, but why does it matter to the country as a whole?
Правда об этой трагедии нужна только родственникам. И, наверное,
the truth about this tragedy is needed only for the relatives and probably for several dozen researchers who really want to find out the truth. Basically, the entire public interest is based on the fact that this is such a cool, mysterious detective story that fits conspiracy theories very easily. People love to say something is being hidden from us. Bodies were scattered around. There was a big cover-up. They took non-disclosure agreements from everyone, and so on. They really like it. But whatever version we adopt of this story, there will surely be another fact that refutes it.
If people love baffling cases and conspiracy theories, so does Natalia's newspaper. Komsomolskaya Pravda has pushed the government to reopen the case and even lobbied to get one of the bodies exhumed in April 2018, that of Semyon Zolotaryov, who was suspected of being a secret agent for the CIA or the KGB, take your pick. Now Natalia wants more bodies dug up. She thinks, in absence of other evidence, it's the best way forward.
Для нас рассекретили 24 листа.
24 pages were declassified for us, but not all of the documents. Some are still filed under top secret, and I don't know why. In my opinion, and in the opinion of an expert, the bodies of all the dead should be exhumed. After examining the injuries of at least the bones of the skeletons, it would be possible to understand whether it was an avalanche, whether they were crushed by a slab of snow, or it was, after all, people who killed them there.
Или все-таки это были люди, которые их там убивали.
So could they have been murdered? Well, that's the latest theory doing the rounds on Russian television. Earlier this month, a programme called Na samom dele, which means In Truth, ran an hour-long special.
Шокирующий поворот в деле о гибели студентов на перевале Дятлова.
A forensic pathologist told a shocked studio audience that one of the students was tied to a tree and tortured before his death. Tatiana Perminova, Igor Dyatlov's sister, finds all this speculation hard to take. She and the other family members would prefer their loved ones to rest in peace.
What
new things would come of it? All of the injuries have been described in sufficient detail. And emotionally speaking, this is very hard. Just imagine digging up their coffins. But if there is no other way to find the answers, okay, let's see what happens next. So many years have passed and still nothing is clear. And people are still interested. This is what surprises me the most after so many years. There's something in this tragedy that stirred the whole world.
Чем-то привлекла, значит, чем-то привлекла.
The more time goes by, the fewer people there are with first-hand accounts of what happened, and this allows all manner of fantasies to take flight. The prosecutor's investigation won't report back until the end of the year, but whatever its findings are, they're unlikely to satisfy everyone. I lived in Russia in the early 90s, and I'm still a frequent visitor, so it doesn't surprise me that most refuse to believe the official version of events. Governments are distrusted everywhere, yet in Russia the suspicion is especially deep-rooted. Conspiracies help unite powerless people against an imagined other. While the West is currently reeling over accusations of election meddling, the Dyatlov Mystery is a reminder that rumours of subversion of the truth by hidden forces are nothing new for the Russian people. The Dyatlov Pass Mystery was presented by me, Lucy Ash, and produced by Richard Fenton Smith.